My name is Carla Mendez. I am 38 years old. I want to tell you about the day I left a house that was never mine, and what I learned 2 hours later from a phone call I was not expecting, from a woman I had only spoken to once, about a decision that had been made without my knowledge in a city I had never visited. I was married to a man named David for 6 years. We met when I was 29, at a conference we were both attending for work, and for the first 2 years the relationship was straightforward and warm in a way I had not experienced before. David was attentive in a way that felt meaningful to me at the time. He noticed things, remembered things, wanted to be involved in the details of my life. It was only later that I came to understand the difference between interest and inventory. We married after 18 months of dating. I moved into his apartment first, and then about a year into the marriage, we moved together into a house in the suburb where his parents lived, about 12 minutes from their front door. I want to be specific about that distance, 12 minutes, because it turned out to be the governing fact of the next 4 years of my life. David's mother, Irene, was a woman who had built her identity around her son in the way that some mothers do when other anchors fail them. Her marriage to David's father had been difficult in ways she never spoke about directly, but referenced constantly through implication, through small asides that positioned herself as someone who had sacrificed and endured rather than lived. David was her primary relationship, had been for most of his adult life, and when he married me, that fact did not change. It simply reorganized around me as a new variable to be managed. I did not understand this for the first year. I thought Irene was involved. I thought her frequency of visits, her detailed opinions about how we arranged our kitchen and what we ate for dinner and where we should go for the holidays were expressions of enthusiasm about her son's new life. I thought when she spoke about the house as theirs, meaning hers and David's, it was a figure of speech. It was not a figure of speech. The house we lived in was purchased jointly, with David paying the full down payment from savings his parents had contributed to over the years, and my income going toward the mortgage. On paper, this seemed like a reasonable arrangement for two people who entered a marriage with different financial histories. What I did not fully register at the time was that the down payment money came with Irene's sense of proprietorship attached. She did not say this directly. She said it through years of small, consistent behavior that added up to a single message delivered in 100 different ways. This is my house, you are a guest in it. She had keys, she used them. She came by on weekday afternoons while I was at work and would mention at dinners that week things she had noticed during those visits, the way I had reorganized a pantry shelf, the product I was using on the kitchen counter. Once she mentioned a book she had seen on my nightstand with a tone that made clear she had an opinion about it. When I asked David to speak to her about the unannounced visits, the conversation he had with her resulted in her telling him she was only trying to help, and David relaying this to me as though it resolved something. I do not want to describe this as a sudden realization because it was not. It was gradual in the way that erosion is gradual. I stopped inviting friends over because I could not predict when Irene might appear. I stopped decorating rooms the way I wanted to because her feedback on anything I changed was so immediate and pointed that the pleasure of making a space mine disappeared before it could form. I started measuring my own comfort in the house against what Irene might think of it, and I understood one afternoon, sitting in a kitchen that I had never fully claimed, that I had spent 4 years becoming a smaller version of myself in order to fit into a space that had never been allocated for the full version. The marriage itself was complicated in ways that I am still untangling. David was not unkind. He was genuinely convinced, I think, that his mother's involvement was normal, that my discomfort was a personality incompatibility that I should work on rather than an environment problem that he should address. He saw his mother's closeness as a feature of his family culture rather than a choice he was making to prioritize her comfort over mine. He had grown up inside it and could not see the edges of it, which I understand better now than I did then. When you have lived inside a particular dynamic your whole life, it does not look like a dynamic, it just looks like the way things are. And the person asking you to see it differently looks like the one creating the problem rather than naming it. We went to couples counseling for 8 months. Our therapist was clear-eyed and helpful and pointed out, with increasing directness over those months, that the pattern she was seeing was not one that would shift without David making a fundamental decision about whose needs took precedence in our marriage. David heard this and believed he was already making that decision, that I simply was not giving him credit for the effort. I finally left in October, 2 years after I first brought the issue formally to David's attention in a conversation I had prepared for weeks. I did not leave in anger. I left in the quiet way you leave when you have been slowly convinced by accumulating evidence that the door is not going to open from the other side. There is a particular kind of grief in that kind of leaving, one that does not have a clean, dramatic shape to it, because you are not leaving in response to a single event, but in response to a pattern. And patterns do not have a clear start or end, only a weight that eventually becomes heavier than the alternatives. I had been planning it for 3 months. I had rented an apartment in a neighborhood closer to my office, had arranged to move my things over 2 weekends, had spoken to a lawyer about the financial arrangements, which were more complicated than I wanted them to be because of the down payment structure and the years I had contributed to the mortgage without accumulating equivalent equity. The legal details were unresolved. I was leaving the physical space first, and the paperwork would follow. Irene knew I was leaving that Saturday. David had told her, and she had come to the house that morning without being invited, which was consistent. She stood in the doorway of what had been our bedroom while I carried boxes through the hallway, and she said things that I had expected her to say and had prepared myself to hear without responding to. She said I was making a mistake. She said I would come to understand what I was walking away from. She said the house, the life, the family were things I would spend the rest of my time trying to find again and never succeeding. She saved the most direct version for the front door. As I carried the last box to my car, she stood in the doorway and told me I would regret this, that I would come crawling back, that leaving this house was the worst decision I would ever make. I put the box in the trunk. I got in the car. I drove away. I want to be honest about what those first 2 hours felt like, because I think people sometimes imagine that walking away from something difficult feels immediately like relief. It did not, at least not entirely. There was relief, but there was also the specific heaviness of 6 years and the awareness that my life was going to require significant rebuilding, and the occasional intrusive memory of Irene in the doorway saying what she had said with complete conviction. I was 40 minutes into the drive when my phone rang through the car speakers. The name on the screen was Sandra Howell, and I almost did not answer because I did not immediately recognize it. I answered because I had been waiting on a few calls that week and did not want to miss anything important. Sandra Howell was a realtor, not my realtor, not David's realtor, not anyone I had retained in connection with the house I had just left. She was a realtor from a firm in Denver, Colorado, which is a city I have visited once in my life. She said she was calling because she was working with buyers who were very interested in a property and needed to reach the co-owner to discuss the situation. She said she had a note that I might be reachable at this number and asked if I was Carla Mendez, listed as a joint mortgage holder on the property at our address. I pulled over. I asked her to explain what she meant by buyers. She said she had been working with a couple for several months who were relocating from Denver and were very motivated, and that they had identified the property through a listing. I asked her what listing. She said the property had been listed for sale approximately 3 weeks earlier. I sat in my parked car on the side of a road I did not know well and understood several things simultaneously. The house had been listed for sale. I had not been told. My name was on the mortgage. The listing had gone up 3 weeks earlier, which was during a period when David and I had still been in the house together, during which he had given me no indication that he was planning to sell. Whatever conversations he had been having about the sale, he had been having them without me. I called my lawyer from the parking lot. She was not surprised in the way I might have hoped she would be. which told me this was a thing that happened, that people did. She told me what I needed to know about my rights as a joint mortgage holder, which were more substantial than David had apparently calculated, and what the process would look like going forward, which was going to be longer and more formal than either of us had originally planned for. I am not going to tell you this resolved quickly or cleanly, because it did not. The legal process around the house took 11 months. There were attorneys on both sides and a mediator, and several conversations that I would have preferred not to have. What I will tell you is that I left that process with a settlement that reflected my actual contribution to the property over 5 years, which was considerably more than I would have received if I had not been on the phone with Sandra Howell if I had not known to ask the right questions in the right order starting from that afternoon. Earring's prediction was specific. She had said I would regret leaving that house. She had said I would come crawling back. I have not regretted it. I have not gone back. The apartment I moved into that October is not as large as the house was, and it does not have a yard, but every shelf in it holds exactly what I chose to put there, and no one has a key to it who was not given one by me. And when I come home in the evening, the space I walk into has exactly the shape I made for it, which turns out to be a thing I had not known I was missing until I had it again. I think about Irene sometimes, not with bitterness exactly, but with the particular clarity that comes when you have enough distance from something to see it plainly. She was not wrong that the house was important. She was wrong about why and wrong about what it meant that I was leaving it. What I was leaving was not a home. I had never quite been allowed to make it one. What I drove away from that Saturday was a structure I had been paying for and living inside without ever being fully welcome in it. And the regret she predicted never came because regret requires having left something that was actually yours. The realtor called back 2 weeks after our first conversation to ask where things stood. I told her things were in process and thanked her for the call. She said she hoped everything worked out, in the way that people say that when they are being professional and kind. She had no idea what she had done by picking up the phone and dialing the number her contact had given her. She was just doing her job. Most of the things that change the course of a life are like that. They do not announce themselves. They arrive as a phone call from a stranger on a road you do not know well, and you pull over and you sit still for a moment, and then you start asking the right questions.